August 12, 1942, motor torpedo boat base, Tulagi Harbor, Solomon Islands. The Radio Shack smelled like dust and hot metal as the operator punched each letter into the log, breath tight in his chest. Henderson Field was calling. Japanese destroyers, southeast through the slot. Multiple ships. Estimated arrival Iron Bottom Sound. 0200 hours. The note slid across the desk to Lieutenant Hugh Robinson, among the first PT boat skippers to reach these islands. He read it twice, then looked out toward the black water that swallowed sound and light, the way a jungle swallows a path. 4 boats, unknown number of destroyers. The math was ugly, but a thought took root, one he didn't dare say out loud. If they couldn't stop the Tokyo Express, maybe they could make it bleed time. No one on Tulagi knew it yet, but those 77-foot wooden darts were about to invent a new kind of pressure, not decisive on their own, not clean, not glamorous, the kind of pressure that turns a night run into a gamble, that steals minutes from the enemy's schedule until minutes become hours, then weeks, then the shape of a whole campaign. Since the Marines splashed ashore on Guadalcanal that August, darkness had belonged to Japan. Daylight was American. The airplanes from Henderson Field owned it. But when the sun slid under the horizon, the Imperial Navy came alive. Destroyers roared down the slot with practiced confidence, shouldering through swell and spray, their Type 93 long lance torpedoes deadly far past the range American crews imagined possible. They moved like predators with night eyes. Lookouts read the ocean's surface the way farmers read clouds. Gunners slept with the rhythm of star shells in their heads. The Tokyo Express wasn't a nickname that said speed. It was a warning that said inevitability. Savo Island had proved that. In a single nightmare burst earlier that August, heavy cruisers went down in half an hour, the sea burning where oil met fire. 4 ships. 32 minutes. American radar had been there, and somehow not there, confused, filtered, misread. Japanese optics and training had not been confused. Their torpedoes reached farther than textbooks allowed. In headquarters far from the smell of cordite, someone drew a line from night to Japanese advantage and underlined it twice. That's where the mosquito boats came in. Industrial ingenuity boiled down to something you could roll down a ramp. Squadron 2's Elko 77-footers displaced about 45 tons, barely a shadow in deep water. And yet everything about them was bigger than it looked. 2 layers of mahogany planking formed a hull that didn't fight the ocean as much as flex with it. The draft was just 5 feet. They could cut across flats and shoals that would make a destroyer sweat. They mounted twin 50-caliber turrets and 4 21-inch tubes, and they wore speed like a promise. Lieutenant Roland West Holm walked his boat at dusk, fingertips tapping each bolt and handle by habit. 2 twin 50s, 4 Mark 8 torpedoes, and the bitter truth every crew learned faster than they wanted. The fish were flawed. Magnetic detonators that turned temperamental in the tropics. Depth settings that made torpedoes behave like they were chasing ghosts. Half the time, the weapon they trusted most behaved like rumor. So they leaned harder into the one weapon that never lied if you treated it right. The Packard engines. 3 of them, 4 M2500s. 12 cylinders each, throats like trumpets. Raw power, 350 horsepower per engine, enough to throw a boat forward to 41 knots in calm water, and 35 when it mattered. In the Solomon Sea, that was the difference between making a story and becoming one. Eldon Genta listened to those engines the way a violinist listens to strings. Motor machinists mate. First class, Detroit-born, Detroit-trained. A Packard man before he wore navy blue. He could diagnose a cam timing hiccup in the dark by the way a vibration crept through the deck. In Tulagi's humidity, he'd nudge carburetor settings and built a checklist that sounded like a prayer. Heat the blocks to the right temp, crack the mixture here, tweak the ignition timing there, test the cooling flow twice. He'd tell the new kids, "You give me clean fuel and half a chance, I'll give you a sprint when the ocean turns to teeth." Across the slot, Commander Koshi Kaneda stood on a Fubuki-class destroyer's bridge, 3 destroyers under his hand, 28 knots down a black corridor he could have drawn from memory. Tonight's job wasn't heroic, it was arithmetic. 800 drums of supplies to Cape Esperance. Roll them near the beach, let them bob in, swim them ashore. Inefficient? Absolutely. But better than trying a tidy unload with Henderson's planes, already counting down to dawn. Maybe a third of the cargo would touch sand, maybe less. The rest would be gifts to the sea. But it kept the garrison alive enough to fight tomorrow, and sometimes tomorrow was the only metric that mattered. A destroyer at speed is a paradox, powerful but clumsy at knife-fighting range. She needs room, hundreds of yards to swing fully through a turn, deeper water to keep her keel honest. Guns that aren't built to punch down at something skimming so close, it feels like a rumor. A PT boat piloted with nerve turns those facts into angles. October 13th, 1942. 2,330 hours. 4 PTs from Squadron 2 hung in the shadow of Savo Island, engines barely murmuring, phosphorescence muted to a sullen glow. No chatter, hand signals, shielded blinker lights. Lieutenant Lester Gamble in PT-48 set the line, spacing the boats 500 yards apart, all eyes and ears. The Mark I eyeball, they called it, because in those nights your pupils were your radar and your nerve was your air search. At 23:47, a lookout hissed for attention, dark shapes where the horizon bent. 3 destroyers, column formation, 25 knots, likely bound for Cape Esperance. Doctrine said, you come from different angles, make the big ship split its watching, turn its guns into indecision. Doctrine also hadn't lived with torpedoes that sometimes forgot their job. Gamble picked concentration. 1 thrust, all at once. Starboard quarter of the trailing tin can, 500 yards, fire, then scatter and trust your engines to finish the sentence. PT-48 slid forward, throttles at a purr until the range ticked down to 1,000 yards. Gamble shoved them forward. The Packard sang and the hull lifted, sprinting toward a ship that blotted out a chunk of starlight. At 500 yards, he let 2 torpedoes go, noses angled 30 degrees to lead the target. Trails of bubbles wrote letters no one wanted to read. On the destroyer, a lookout shouted, "Gurai! Gurai!" and the helmsman bit the wheel into a hard left. The torpedoes slid behind her stern, so close you could taste the miss. Then the night went white. Star shells. 5-inch guns testing the water around PT-48 with columns of spray. Gamble threw the boat into a drunken dance at full throttle, zigzagging through geometry scribbled in fire. PT-46 came in next, pushing to 400 yards before firing. 1 fish wandered like it lost its nerve. The other kissed steel and refused to explode, the detonator sulking. On shore and in headquarters, claims and counterclaims would coil around the fight. The Japanese logs that survived said the destroyers lived to steam again. But here was the thing nobody back home could feel. The PTs forced those big ships to dump cargo too soon. Drums splashed where currents got a vote. The shore parties swore into the night. Less reached land. The first proof that harassment could rewrite the math, even when explosions didn't. Word of those runs slid across Admiral William Halsey's desk. It wasn't decisive. It was annoying. And that mattered. By November, there were a dozen PTs operating from Tulagi, and with them came tactics hammered together on the job. Intelligence sniffed out the rhythm of the Express. Every 3 to 5 nights, weather permitting, 4 to 8 destroyers, back and forth, on routes so familiar you could sketch them in the dark, down past Savo, up to beaches on Guadalcanal's north coast, where men unloaded at a jog with one eye on the eastern sky. Lieutenant Commander Thomas G. Warfield wrote a practical gospel. Boats in 3s, 1 to shoot, 2 to distract. If the fish misbehaved, and half the time they would, guns would force a zig or a zag, a hesitation that turned unloading into chaos. PTs weren't the heroes of line-of-battle engagements. After Allied cruisers took their beating in surface actions, these mosquitoes became part of a net. Air, subs, surface ships, small craft, drawn tight around the Express. The impact hid in the margins. A formation spends more fuel, crews lose sleep, shoulders tighten on the bridge, speed stays high through places where prudence would say slow. Rudders carve harder. Cargo goes overboard early. Efficiency slides from 30% to 20% to less, until the graph stops being a slope and becomes a cliff. 11 destroyers tried one of the largest supply runs yet. PTs put out more than 30 torpedoes and had no clean hit to show for it. On paper, a failure. At sea, a message. Japanese reports started carrying the same sentence with different phrasing. Enemy motor torpedo boats made the job exceedingly hazardous, forcing constant evasive action. They weren't invulnerable, far from it, but they were everywhere the big ships didn't want them to be. PT-59 proved what the little holes could do when a target's speed didn't erase the chance. A Japanese submarine, I-3, trying to sneak supplies in. Slower, less agile, cornered by small boats with a sense for angles and nerve enough to push. One of the few confirmed kills the PT community wore with quiet pride. Admiral Raizo Tanaka, arguably the sharpest destroyer commander in the theater, took it personally. He led the next run himself, his flagship the new Akizuki-class destroyer Teruzuki, teeth bared and senses keyed to small boat tricks. 10 other destroyers ran with him, 6 loaded with drums. This would be a lesson. At 23:15, PTs from Squadron 2 spotted the formation off Cape Esperance. Tanaka had left Teruzuki as rear guard, a club at the back of the pack to swat mosquitoes while the supply ships nosed inshore. PT-37 under Lester Gamble, PT-40 under John Sears, PT-48 again, boats and men who knew each other's breathing by then, angled for the shot. The tactic was the same: fracture attention, make the big ship think about too many things, then ride speed into a place where the math moved. At 23:23, one or more of them, history is fuzzy here, the sea's memory written in flashes, loosed torpedoes at about 500 yards. This time, steel met steel the way the crews always imagined it in practiced dreams. A Mark 8 found Teruzuki's port, quarter near the steering gear. The blast buckled metal where the ship's will to turn should have lived. Speed bled away to 12 knots. Fuel poured, caught, painted the night with fire. For miles, the water flashed orange where the flames met chop. Tanaka himself was wounded. Command passed while Naganami came alongside to haul him and the worst hurt away. 30 minutes of rescue churned the formation into a milling question mark. Supply destroyers, panicked by the light and the uncertainty, got rid of cargo fast. The rest of the night turned into a grim wait for dawn. At 04:40 on December 12th, the heat inside Teruzuki set off her depth charges. You don't forget that kind of sound. It broke her back and sent her down in 800 feet of water. She became the largest Japanese warship the PT community could claim without debate. It was a peak, and they knew it. They would not get another destroyer, but a peak matters because it tells you the mountain had a slope, and that slope was trending the same way the whole time. The Imperial records later put frank words to it. Motor torpedo boats, together with air and surface attacks, were making night supply increasingly untenable. Delivery efficiency fell below what a garrison could live on. Tanaka recovered, returned to the fight, and said the part most men only thought. The boats rarely hit, but they never let you rest. When January 1943 came, the Express changed shape. Submarines and barges took on more of the work. Slower, smaller, more survivable in some ways, but horrendously inefficient. A submarine could carry maybe 20 tons. A destroyer, 10 times that. Guadalcanal needed 400 tons a day. You can't cheat that equation. Eventually, the math starts rhyming with hunger. On Tulagi and at Melville, back in Rhode Island, the story bent toward adaptation. The Navy built 531 PT boats before the war ended. They were cheap, about 1/30 of the cost of a destroyer, and fast to produce. Losses were real, 69 boats from all causes, but the math of replacement favored small and many. Melville trained over 1,000 officers and 10,000 enlisted on a crash schedule that turned teenagers into navigators and gunners in 8 weeks. By mid-1943, the boats got SO radar sets that could see out 15 miles. And late that year, the Mark 13 torpedo arrived with fewer gremlins living inside. The mosquito bite got sharper. The Japanese tried to swat in return. Destroyer escorts swept ahead. It helped in theory, but split their strength in practice. Float planes dropped flares that lit PTs like actors on a stage. The flares also told American eyes exactly where the destroyers were. The ocean is a patient teacher when both sides are improvising. Barges, armored, lumbering, soon became the PT's favorite prey. If they couldn't always knife a destroyer, they could gnaw the supply chain where it was thickest. The crews were young, 22 on average, most of them. volunteers hunting action and finding a life that felt more like camping on a wet roof than serving on a ship. No proper galley, buckets instead of heads. Canned food and sleep on deck when rain and oxygen allowed. The tropical sickness tally read like a medical brochure no one wanted. Combat stress didn't hide in berthings. The boats were too small for that. Everybody was exposed when the shooting started. Casualty rates ran a third higher than any other naval outfit, and yet morale stayed strange and stubbornly high. Maybe it was the volunteer thing. Maybe it was how a crew on a wooden boat becomes a family, because you can hear each other's heartbeats through the planks. One night in August 1943 wrote itself onto America's memory for reasons far beyond tactics. PT-109, August 2nd, a Black Sea, a destroyer named Amagiri, a collision so sudden men didn't have time to be afraid before they were in the water. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy led what came after with stubborn grace, getting his men to safety, dragging an injured crewman for hours. The story became legend, but at its core it carried the same truth that Gil Genta's checklists carried. In those waters, survival was a choreography of grit and inches. It also clarified something the PT community already knew. Against a destroyer you could rarely stand and trade. You lived by ambush, angle, confusion, speed, and the knowledge that your role was to make the other side's timetable crumble. When the campaign around Guadalcanal finally tilted for good, analysts looked backward and tried to put numbers on everything. One destroyer definitively sunk by PT action, Teruzuki. One submarine, I-3, and then a grim ledger of barges and drums and missed landings that added up to starvation and retreat. The value wasn't just in ships on the bottom. It was in forcing a great navy to move from destroyers to submarines to barges. Each step a confession that the original plan no longer fit the problem. Modern fast attack craft owe a debt to those nights. The weapons have changed, torpedoes to guided missiles, but the logic remains. Small, fast, networked, coordinated with air and surface partners, punching above their weight by being hard to hit and everywhere at once. The PTs didn't win sea control. They helped deny it to the enemy in the hours that mattered most. There was one last image to hold, something from long after the shooting stopped. In 2024, divers found Teruzuki where the record said she should be, 800 feet down in Iron Bottom Sound. The ship that took a mosquito's bite and bled out in the dark lay in quiet now. A teacher more than a trophy. A reminder that courage and persistence can bend a campaign even when most nights end without a clean kill to write home about. If you stand on Tulagi at dusk and look across the water toward Guadalcanal, the wind still comes out of the slot like a long breath. You can see why destroyer captains loved the speed of it, and why young men in wooden boats learned to read the chop like a language. You can imagine Hugh Robinson reading that first message from Henderson Field, the one that set 4 boats against an unknown force and asked them to try anyway. You can hear Packard engines warming under canvas. You can picture Roland West Holm patting metal to make sure it would behave when the ocean turned mean. You can see Eldon Genta's hands, black with oil, as he listened to an engine and smiled because it sounded right. And you can trace the campaign the way a finger traces islands on a map. August 12th, 1942, first warnings and first nerves. October 13th, star shells and misses that still mattered. December 12th, Teruzuki's back breaking as heat found explosives. Early 1943, submarines in place of destroyers, barges in place of submarines. A line of supply turned into a trickle. August 2nd, 1943, PT-109, heroism that looked like endurance. Mid-1943, radar and better torpedoes sharpening the mosquito's sting. Months of hunger ashore. Months of complicated bravery at sea. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's logic had been clean at the start. Own the night, and you own the lifeline. Own the lifeline, and you own the island. The Americans made the night unpredictable, not safe for anyone, not even for themselves. But unpredictability cut one way harder than the other when you're trying to run a schedule. The PTs turned night into a place where the Express had to sprint blind and hope. Hope is not logistics. In the end, that's the lesson tucked inside the engine rumble and the tracer streaks. A big Navy can dominate a fight. A small boat can dominate a moment. Layer enough moments and you warp the fight's shape. The PT crews didn't leave neat victories lined up in a row. They left ruined plans. And sometimes ruined plans are how wars are lost. The men who lived it would tell you the work was ugly and exhausting, and sometimes felt useless in the moment. They would also tell you there was a sweetness to a clean run, slipping in, pushing a big ship to flinch, then vanishing at 35 knots behind spray and starlight. They understood that their boats were both fragile and dangerous, that courage and caution had to live in the same body at once. They were not perfect, and their weapons often betrayed them, but their persistence did not. If you listen hard enough, you can still hear what the Japanese officers wrote in post-action notes but could not fix. Enemy motor torpedo boats make operations extremely hazardous, must maintain constant evasive action. That sentence is more than complaint. It is the sound of strategic erosion. It is the recognition that even a navy that could write its name across a night sky with star shells had to go somewhere else to keep doing its job. And somewhere else couldn't feed the men on Guadalcanal. So, the wooden boats did what they could, night after night, until what they could was enough. Not alone, never alone. Always part of a weave, aircraft overhead, submarines lurking, cruisers and destroyers prowling, scouts on dark ridgelines scribbling coordinates for dawn. But essential. The way a knot is essential, even if you only notice it when it slips. The last word belongs to a survivor who knew both fear and professionalism in the same heartbeat. Commander Tamichihara, who encountered PTs more times than he probably cared to remember, summed it with a sentence that sits like a verdict. They rarely hit us, but they never let us rest. That's the legacy. Not a kill list, a sleepless enemy, a supply line turned into a question mark, an island campaign that twisted because 4 boats at Tulagi went out on a night in August and looked for destroyers in the dark, and found them, and kept finding them, until the math gave up.